Thank you all for joining us today for a very special webinar, which I'm very excited about. I'm Tatiana Ginsberg. I'm the Director of Artistic Projects and a Master Collaborator at Dieu Donné. 2026 marks the 250th anniversary of the United States and the 50th anniversary of Dieu Donné. On the eve of these anniversaries, we thought it would be nice to reflect on some of the ways in which handmade paper has contributed to the preservation of some of our national treasures, including the Charters of Freedom and the books housed in the Library of Congress. Joining us today, we have two very accomplished paper makers who are both very dear to me personally as mentors, and I'm very, very happy that we're all together. Tim Barrett is a professor emeritus and past director of the University of Iowa Center for the Book, as well as a MacArthur Genius Fellow, a Fulbright Fellow, and a well-known papermaker and author. Paul Wong is Dieu Donné's own artistic director emeritus. In his 38 years in the studio, he worked with over 1,000 artists, as well as maintaining his own artistic practice and developing custom papers, such as he'll be discussing today. And I'd like to thank our sponsors for this program, especially the public funds from the National Endowment for the Arts, which we feel very, very fortunate to have had in this year, and the New York State Council on the Arts with the support of the governor and the New York State Legislature and the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs, as well as generous foundation and individual support. And so we really appreciate all of our sponsors. During this webinar, if you have any questions, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And I would encourage you, if a question comes to mind, just put it in the chat there. And then we will answer all the questions at the end. But feel free to populate that at any time. And you can also turn on automated captions by clicking the closed caption buttons at the bottom of your screen if you'd like to. And then you'll be able to see a recording of this talk and all of our past talks on our website and through YouTube. After this webinar is over, it will be posted. So it is being recorded today. So without further ado, I will turn it over to Tim Barrett.
Great. Thank you, Tatiana. I'd like everybody to know that Tatiana and Paul and I have had a great time planning this session, and we're real pleased to have all of you in attendance. And just to reemphasize what Tatiana said, please jot down your questions. We're eager to have a conversation with you. We've made a point of trying to confine our comments to the first half hour or so. Under the heading of hand paper making contributions to the preservation of our national heritage, probably one of the more interesting stories is the Charters of Freedom project that the UI Center for the Book Paper Facility was involved in. This whole story starts with the 1950s when these documents, the Charters of Freedom, Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the Constitution, were encased in between two pieces of glass with a spacer in between at the edges. And then the seams were soldered shut, and the air inside was evacuated, and an inert gas was injected into the space. But by the late 1990s, there was some concern on the part of conservators about how effective that seal had actually been. There was no internal monitoring system. And there was a desire to inspect the actual documents on parchment, and other things were going a little haywire, like the glass itself was beginning to degrade. So with a special allocation from Congress, National Archives conservators and scientists from the National Institute of Science and Technology put together a plan for creating brand new state-of-the-art encasements milled out of solid blocks of titanium. I mean, no expense was spared. They really wanted to do this right this time and have state-of-the-art internal atmospheric monitoring. The rotunda itself was renovated at the same time. And unbeknownst to me, the conservators involved at the National Archives were discussing the fact that the parchment document would sit on this perforated metal plate. And shouldn't they have a layer of paper? It would be better to have a layer of paper beneath the document to help make the document more visible, to provide a cushion against the perforated plate, and to help stabilize the relative humidity within the encasement. About this time, we had been involved in making Japanese style papers and European style papers for use in conservation. Lynn Amley here hanging some book weight and paper case sheets to dry. And I received a phone call from Don Etherington, who was part of the conservation team then at the National Archives. And he explained this ongoing project, and he said, what would you do if we asked you to make the paper that these documents would sit on? And he interjected that the paper needed to have a mass similar to the mass of the parchment documents. And I said, well, how about if we made some very traditionally produced Japanese style thin sheets of mending tissue, and you could accumulate however many sheets you needed to equal the mass of the parchment document. John Etherington's British, right? So he comes back and he says, Tim, come on, can't you do better than that? This is an American project, for God's sakes. And so luckily, I was able to tell Don that we had been experimenting with making paper out of 100% American grown textile quality cotton, which you see in the foreground here, hemp in the background. And I said we could produce paper out of this cotton. It would be completely free from any chemical treatment other than the cooking in lime that we would use and the washing in hard water, slightly alkaline hard water that we would include as a step. And he said, all right, now you're talking. This sounds like real possibility. Send us a technical proposal for exactly what you would do to produce this paper, which we did. And they did a series of tests on samples that we sent them, a cold or hot extract pH, and the Oddie test, which tells you if a given specimen of paper produces any off-gassing that might be harmful to a document or an artifact in an enclosed space. And our specimens samples passed judgment and were approved, and we got the job. So I'm going to show you a series of slides that kind of describe how these sheets were made. A lot of people have asked, weren't you just thrilled? Weren't you just amazed when you got this job? And the answer is yes, but more than that, we were mildly terrified about the responsibility. We knew we had to do this right. And so it created a real intense focus on this particular project. We had to upgrade in size. This was the largest sheet we'd made up to that point was 22 by 30, and we needed to make a 36 by 36-inch sheet. That required a new decal box made by Janet Pullman. And in this shot, you can see Lynn Amley in the background and Sarah Langworthy in the foreground forming a sheet. We had a counterweight system on the sides that helped suspend the mold, and they developed a whole series of exact coordinated movements for forming each sheet. Those of you who are familiar with papermaking know that this upper open wooden frame is called a decal. And after the sheet has been formed and the excess water has passed through the porous surface of the mold, the decal can be removed, leaving the new sheet on the surface of the mold. The mold then needs to be turned upside down with the new sheet adhering. Don't worry, it won't fall off. And then it's placed right on top of a damp woolen felt. The two paper makers then, again in unison, go through a series of movements to make sure the new sheet is pushed into intimate contact with the damp felt, and then they snap the mold away, leaving the new sheet smooth and unwrinkled on top of the damp felt. So another damp felt goes down on top, and then this process is repeated until you have an accumulated sandwich of, in our case, about 12 or 15 sheets. And that then went into a press, an air bladder press. I'd always wanted to build one of these, and with Howie Clark's engineering advice, we were able to put one together. And this air bladder, when it was filled up with 100 psi air pressure, which is not that much, actually generates 80 tons of pressure. So this was just what we needed for this particular application. After the sheets come out of the press, then they were added to a stack dryer. And I think we made two thicknesses, sort of a medium weight and a lighter weight. And that was sufficient for the conservators to take exactly what they needed for each document on parchment. So, as I mentioned earlier, this was part of a major rotunda renovation. And if you haven't been there to see this, I would definitely recommend you take the time to go. You go in there and there's this kind of quiet atmosphere. There's atmosphere of reverence. People are talking to each other, but there's nobody shouting or yelling. This is kind of a special place. And they also went to a lot of trouble in this renovation to make sure people in wheelchairs could see these documents because the Declaration of Independence, used to have to walk upstairs to see it and walk down again on the other side. So this was part of the idea of the renovation. And now, you have to wait in line, but you can get really close to American history, and it's really quite something. And if you know about this story of the paper sitting underneath the documents, and if you get your head tipped at just the right angle, you can see that piece of handmade paper underneath the documents. And it's a real source of pride for those of us from Iowa, obviously, but for anybody associated with the hand paper making community. Now, what's interesting to me about this project is that the permanence of the paper we made was a big deal. It was a central issue, the chemical stability of the paper. But its durability was a non-issue. When you start to get into making papers for rare book conservators, then the book conservators need papers that have a surface character, pliancy, surface look and feel that will sit comfortably next to the historical papers. And this complicates matters for the hand paper maker. Conservators at the Library of Congress received support to start this end paper project, which Paul will tell you more about shortly. And in it, they got into a fascinating dialogue with a number of us in the hand paper making community. They were nudging us to do things like gelatin size. This particular shot here is of some red pigmented paper case paper being gelatin sized. That's probably about 4 sheets just coming out of the bath. But they also wanted us to do loft drying. These were things that they had read about or heard about in the history of the craft. And so, of course, if we just ask the hand paper makers to do this, they'll be able to, but it turns out to be more complicated than that. And I'm going to turn things over to Paul now. He can tell you about Dieu Donné's involvement in Dieu Donné's beginnings and also its involvement in the end paper project as well. So let's see, Paul, I'm gonna stop sharing my screen and Tatiana's gonna bring Paul's
Okay.
slides up, I believe, right?
Great.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Tim, for the introduction and all of you for participating today. Um, yes, it was a very challenging project that the Library of Congress introduced to us. But let me go back a little bit in time, like 50 years ago, when I went to grad school with Sue Gozen, who started Dieu Donné in New York um, in the year 1976. She was a book, well, she's a book artist studying book arts at the University of Wisconsin, and she wanted to set up her press and build a paper studio on Crosby Street in Soho to make rag papers for her book projects and for the wider art community. She researched sources from rag dealers and buying bales of new cotton and linen clippings as the fibers that she wanted to use, along with other materials such as using dry artist pigments to color the paper and internal sizing. In the 70s, making paper by hand was a lost art and required extensive research to understand the equipment and the pulp preparation. Every papermaker then had to figure it out for themselves with help from predecessors such as information um, gathered by Dart Hunter and Douglas Howell. The handful of young new American papermakers created their own particular way of producing their papers. For Sue, she had a 10-pound Hollander beater and a wet floor built in the loft she lived in. She ordered and found, laid and wove molds. And she had a converted baling machine made for a hydraulic press. With new rags, she decided to cook them in soda ash to soften the fiber as it was way too strong to easily break down in the beater. Each rag had to be tested for its strength to help formalize their beating and develop recipes for various papers. Rags were cut by hand by feeding layers of rag through a cloth cutter designed for the fashion industry. This tedious, time consuming work was what we did that most hand paper makers didn't find economically viable, as they found other semi processed cotton fibers, such as half stuff and linters, to make production paper. But Dieudonné was determined to try to resurrect a way to make paper from a rag source as it was made by hand throughout centuries in Europe. Traditionally, fiber came from discarded, used linen and hemp cloth, which were softened by use and further fermented after cutting and sorting. A stamper was originally used to macerate the fiber into a pulp. Later in the 17th century, the Hollander beater was invented to pulp more efficiently, but cutting the fiber shorter, which resulted in a weaker bond. Sue's book projects were an incentive to develop rag papers, and such experimentation led to making linen and cotton combination papers. During the late 80s, conservation bookbinders such as Gary Frost were developing modern designed limp paper case bindings modeled after prototypes from 16th to 18th century Europe. Others, such as Craig Jensen, the Newberry Library, and other bookbinder and conservators, were ordering our combination papers to use them to repair their book projects. These Dieu Donné papers offered them the possibility of customizing the heavier weight, size, and color of the paper. During this time, by 1989, the Library of Congress saw the potential of a handful of new hand paper makers across the country to fill a need for developing modern, compatible end papers for their repair work on America's rare book collections. Contemporary handmade papers that were available didn't possess the characteristics of the older books from the 15th to 17th centuries. Those conservators, such as Jessie Munn and Barbara Meyer Hoosby, chose 6 papermakers in 1992 and requested them to develop an end paper based on a sample they chose of a 16th century Italian origin they called spirituale. They worked up very rigorous specifications concerning fiber content, weight, strength, sizing, surface texture, laid mold configuration, and color. They left the processing of the paper to the makers. The convening of the paper makers with the conservators and the Library of Congress staff in late 1992 was scheduled to meet at the University of Iowa with their papers to examine and discuss these aesthetic results. The papers each mill made were tested beforehand by the Library of Congress to determine tear strength, folding endurance, aging, and pH. Dieu Donné fundraised to the Crest Foundation to help with costs for the meeting. There was a need for discussing and agreeing on descriptive terminology in talking about the qualities of these papers, with terms such as look through, with backlighting, look down in raking light, surface quality as a loft dried gelatin surface size paper, fiber content, beading methods, endurance, etc. The fascinating thing about the project was how different the results were from each papermaker in appearance and strength factor, even though we all received the same samples from the same 16th century paper. My take on the project was to understand how I could use new rag fibers from modern sources to achieve the qualities they specified. I chose abaca linen rags and added bagasse and or retted flax to mimic the cruder fibers that floated in the spirituale sample. I was looking for the aesthetic qualities in the sample, being an artist and a paper maker. The strength and endurance factor were very high in the resulting paper we made. Our standard process for production paper didn't include the additional steps of loft drying and surfacizing in gelatin. Our early drying methods were inefficient and crude, using the blotter exchange system until we transitioned to a restraint fan and corrugation system. But this could, however, allow the paper to shrink under mild restraint in the blotter exchange, using a controlled weight on top to maintain some surface texture that they required. We formally size paper internally like most paper makers did, so the paper had a more open, less sealed quality the library wanted. All in all, the project with its challenges allowed Dieu Donné to see how our paper stood up with our colleagues. So I want to kind of come around back to Tim and ask him how Iowa handled the project, the end paper project, and its requirements, and like such as what fibers did you use for this paper?
Well, thanks, Paul. Yeah, I haven't dug through our archives enough to know exactly what we did, but in my experience, working with these new raw materials, which, as you mentioned earlier, all hand paper makers were having to deal with one way or another, there's only two ways to get some of that new fiber softer, so it can be a little more appropriate to making papers that sit comfortably next to the historical ones. The only two things I could think of or have been able to hit on are fermentation and dry cutting. So at the time, this holds true for, whether you have new textile cuttings or raw cotton or raw hemp. Um, at the time, I'm pretty sure had been doing quite a bit of work with fermented raw flax fiber, which just beaten straight away in the beater makes a wonderful paper case sheet, but terrible formation for a book paper. But after fermentation, it responds much more quickly to beating, and you can make a nice looking book paper sheet. Um, and I'm pretty sure that's what we started with. I think there was probably some expectation. Nobody ever said anything to me about this at the Library of Congress or to me from the hand paper making community, but I think there was an expectation. Well, Tim will figure out how to do this. Iowa will come up with something really classy. Well, it turns out that the paper we submitted failed the fold endurance test. It wasn't strong enough, and I knew that going into the project. So much to my dismay, we had to add abaca pulp to the fermented fiber, in-house fermented raw flax fiber. And even then, it wasn't really quite right. And I was disappointed in the results, and I think it was one of the less attractive finished sheets. But that all would bring me around to the fact that this problem, the challenge I think that the hand paper makers faced with producing something similar to the historical sheets, including loft drying, is all related to the rag raw material used historically, which you touched on, Paul, and you mentioned that these rags were used again and again historically until they ended up at the paper mill. And at that point, they were so soft and so tender, they weren't even good as wiping rags anymore. That material was perfect for the hand paper maker because uh, some additional fermentation might have been needed, but in the stampers, it shortened up very quickly, produced a well-formed sheet, and more important than anything else, you could loft dry it and not have it shrink like crazy. So it's always been fascinating to me that supposedly these people for generations made paper that was loft dry. And how the hell did they get it dried flat? And toward the end of my career, I retired in 2020, but we were experimenting a lot with loft drying chancery size sheets. So those were about 13 by 18 inches. And even when made from flock cut, so we would take that raw cotton and raw hemp and cut it to 1.5 or 2 millimeters in length, and then ferment it, then cook it in lime. And even with that raw material, those finished sheets, although they looked and felt a lot like the historical sheets, they conkled, they curled when we loft dried them. So then the question was, well, what the heck did they do historically? And it occurred to me that possibly the paper that you made yesterday was up in the loft, cockled and curled to a certain extent. And then when you brought today's making up into the loft, all that moisture coming off of the fresh sheets softened the sheets that were made yesterday, and you could take them down and get them flat. So that's what we started to do. We started to experiment with humidifying their, the slightly cockled sheets, and we were able to come up with a routine for getting them flat. But anyway, that's a side story. I guess in summary, what we came up with in the end paper project was a little disappointing to me. But the dialogue with the other paper makers and the book conservators was wonderful. I recall that one of the first things we made a point of doing, this was in collaboration with the other paper makers and with the book conservators. As soon as everybody got to Iowa City, we sat everybody down and we passed out samples of paper, either historical or ones that we had made and burnished to one degree or another. And we got everyone to, on a score sheet, rank them in terms of good formation, poor formation, smooth surface, rough surface. Uh, and we tallied the results. And as we predicted, people were pretty much on the same page in terms of how they evaluated or characterized these sheets. And that was an important exercise because it brought everybody to the table, literally and kind of psychologically. I think we wanted to dissipate any concern that this was going to be a competitive uh, kind of conversation. I mean, it was, but it was also collaborative. So it was a great thing, and the hand paper making community will be indebted to the book conservators for a long time for pushing us to go ahead and try to make that happen. I seem to recall that Jesse Munn told us that in the end, the papers that they ordered and received from the various paper makers were all different. They were, and you mentioned this too, Paul, they weren't exactly the same. But in the conservation lab, it was great to have drawers with all these different papers that they could select from when treating one book versus another. They could pick something that was most appropriate to the book receiving treatment. So, all things considered, I would say the end paper project was definitely a success.
Yeah, and Paul, we were talking about this before. It sounded like Dieu Donné then made some papers on a somewhat regular basis. Probably Tim Iowa and other colleagues also made papers on a regular basis. So there were, periodic orders of that kind of material, not just from the Library of Congress, but from other people who
Right.
then said, hey, you could make us something, right? So that was something that Dieu Donné did for quite a while.
Mhm.
Right.
Um, but also, I think hopefully, one question I had, and if anybody has questions, now is a great time to put them in the Q&A. Any of you who are listening. But one question that I had was, what's the sort of takeaway from this for in terms of like you've both touched on different things that you learned from the process. But Paul, for example, working with artists and having done all of this research on rag and what, papers would do um, what kinds of things helped you in the future with projects, and then at some point you guys decided to stop making custom paper and really concentrate just on the artist project, which is what we do now. But was there a way in which some of this rag research and some of these paper drying methods that we've been talking about kind of helped with some of those projects?
Oh, most definitely. I think because Dieu Donné started, like really being immersed in experimenting with rags, not just, being limited, like the philosophy of whatever the artist wants, you know, like it wasn't like we were dictating, well, you can only use this or this or this. Like oftentimes an artist would come in and say, can we do this or do this? And so you would jump at the possibility of trying to figure it out. And, with having more experience with all kinds of different fibers and preparing them, um, developing a repertoire of application, you would be able to offer that artist a larger latitude of possibilities in using the process creatively. So, of course, it really, I think, in the long run, really allowed Dieu Donné to really offer much more than perhaps another shop could because of, like the accumulated experience that we were, you know, um, compiling over the years. So,
Yeah, this is great.
yeah.
We have a couple of questions in the chat. Sarah Bertram Hamill, thank you for your question. She asks, I'm wondering if you had a means to test your papers yourself before sending them to conservators, and which tests would you do? Tim, I know you at one point had quite a lot of paper testing equipment, but I don't know if that predated or postdated. And
Well, we did have two MIT fold endurance testers and an Elmendorf tear tester. So that was helpful for us to try to get a grip on what we were making and whether or not it was going to live up to the Library of Congress standards. One of the things they did that we were not able to do was accelerated aging, and that may be where our paper didn't do so well. In other words, if we sent them something that had the required fold endurance, I think it was 150 double folds, um, uh, it was supposed to retain, 80 or 90% of that after accelerated aging, and that was something that weren't able to do. So, uh, the in-house paper testing, a micrometer is something you can use, of course, and hand paper makers do use to group finished sheets and so on. But some of these paper tests that come from the industry are based on specialized instruments.
yeah. We also have a comment and a question from Mina Takahashi. Hello, Mina. And she writes, thank you so much for this presentation. Takes me back, spiritually. I remember the
Yes.
competition and the camaraderie among the paper makers and the aha moments during our in-person discussions at Iowa between conservators and paper makers. I particularly recall how Paul insisted he was approaching the project as an artist and not as a paper maker. This was a kind of an interesting perspective. At the time, I gasped, but later I completely understood what he meant about having the artist's eye, hand, and experience working with artists contributed to the beauty of Dieu Donné's entry into the end paper games. That's a great way to put it. So her question then is, what are other areas of cultural preservation of paper objects today? And what do you feel that they could benefit from this kind of collaborative research approach that happened with the M Paper project? Is there a way that um, paper objects or other kinds of things made out of paper could benefit from this sort of collective pooling of minds
Mhm.
that the end paper project really was such a great sort of beginning step for that.
Yeah, thank you, Mina. I guess I would offer this isn't really an example of collaborative hand paper maker conversation, but it is another example of how innovation on the part of the hand paper maker has contributed something unique to the conservation community. Um, Bill Mentor decades ago said to me during a PBI meeting, he said, you know, when we do guarding, when we take a book apart, an old book apart, and then reinforce the gutter fold with a thin strip of Japanese paper, it's a real pain to tear those strips out of a large sheet of mending tissue from Japan. If we could get the big sheets of Japanese style paper with a watermark in it that would allow us to tear those strips off dry, it would be huge. And I suppose this is a good example of a collaborative atmosphere because at PBI, all sorts of stuff came out of the woodwork. And I said to him, well, I'll tell you what, let's take this cheap placemat Sue that I that we have here from one of the classes, and we use some adhesive tape and put some real bogus watermarks on there. And I made a sheet and we dried it and I showed it to him and he goes, "Yeah, that's exactly it." Anyway, that was the birth of Minter Dry Tear Guard Strip, which was very popular for a while. And it was something that, because I was at the University of Iowa, if anyone had come to me and said, would you show us how to make that? I would gladly have described the situation. But, you know, we were all set up for Japanese style paper making, so it was kind of a no-brainer. Um, since After we started making that stuff, the Japanese started copying us. And there's a middleman in Japan that I'm friends with. And I said, "Yeah, I've seen that stuff out there." He said, "Yeah, but it's not as good as yours." Which is a real compliment. On the other hand, if you can't get very much of it, and like you can't get it now, then what good is that? Anyway, I only mention that because it's another example of the kinds of things that the hand paper making community has offered. I also think of thinner mending tissues being used to repair 2D and 3D works of art. The work that very innovative work that Dieu Donné did with uh, 2D techniques and 3D making 3D works of art, very complicated. Uh, some of them must have been really frustrating, but beautiful results when you have a grip on the process, which Paul and others at Dieu Donné did have and still uh, use with artists on a daily basis.
Yeah, and I would add to that sort of just the nature of studios like Dieu Donné and the University of Iowa Center for the Book, where there are multiple paper makers, there's multiple people coming in with different needs and projects and perspectives. That in itself, in some ways, kind of sparks these new things that might get developed, new techniques, and an exchange between people with different skill sets. So
Mhm.
I think that's also, a real reason why these places are important. Um, Before we got on this Zoom call, we were talking a little bit about raw materials and supplies, and some of those kinds of things were interesting too. Um, were there any particular challenges that you have had with getting the raw materials. Tim and Paul, you both touched on this a little bit, that kind of helped you figure out particular things that you really wanted to work with after that, just figuring out, okay, is getting rag from the textile industry as offcuts just too hard? But, are there other kinds of things like roving? Tim, you mentioned some other, raw materials that you were like, yeah, this is actually a great paper making material that I want to work with more. Are there any things like discoveries like that, or even the equipment, that you built? That bladder press is pretty cool. Like, did you end up using that
Hmm.
for other
This
things?
is a total aside, but that I shared with you two earlier that and Paul didn't mention this, but when you're bringing in all of this new textile cuttings, or in the case of Twin Rock, or old textile cuttings, you have to make really sure you don't get any synthetics in there. And even if you have a bale of new textile cuttings, linen or cotton, you have to make sure there wasn't anything in the wrapping of the bale that was synthetic that gets in there, because even a small amount of it can cause real problems. Anyway, at Twin Rocker, we had, we'd have a box of kitchen matches there, and every sheet that came from Chicago, we'd have to burn a corner of it to make sure there wasn't any synthetic in it. And if there was, it would sputter. But anyway, that was kind of a tedious task, and we went through a lot of boxes of kitchen matches. And one day, Lee McDonald
Mm.
walks into the shop, and he's got a big fat candle in his hand. He goes, "Hey, you guys, look what I got!" And we said, "Good, Lee, a candle. Are you going to use that in your room at night?" And he goes, "No, don't you get it? We don't have to burn all those kitchen matches. We just set this thing up." And then it was one of those forehead slapping moments, where you realize, oh my gosh. Um, but yeah, I think that the three of us were talking about this earlier, the whole raw material raw material sourcing uh, it kind of bumps up against any papermaker's desire to do it the old way when you can't get the old materials that they used to use. And so it creates new problems. And that's where we ended up going to fermentation and dry cutting or shredding. Um, but it means that when bleached cotton liners and commercially produced abaca sheet pulp became available, and especially Cheney Pulp and Paper Company half stuff, you could get 100% unbleached muslin half stuff and other grades, bleached blue jean cuttings. Those weren't really old rags, but uh, they still allowed you to do a lot of the final processing in-house. And so people did draw on those supplies as soon as they became available, because going the old school route was problematic.
Yeah. We have a couple other questions in the chat. One from Emma Hill. This process seems akin to the scientific method. As artists, craftspeople, and researchers, how much material science data did you collect or rely on during this project? And more broadly, how do paper makers navigate the intersection between hands-on material experimentation and scientific research? Well, that's something we've been a lot talking about, sort of how much is um, process based, empirical, and how much really kind of has to be done with an eye towards testing and science. Any comments about that?
Paul, you want to go ahead and I'll chime in, or I can jump in and then you
Um,
can chime in.
I I don't know. My approach is always very intuitive, and we didn't have any kind of testing equipment and so on and so forth. Um, and it was mostly visual. Um, it's hard to, like as an artist, to kind of, I guess, absorb, the intricacies of, um, like how scientific are you going to get with paper making? And I guess it wasn't, for me like a top priority in being motivated to make paper. Like I was looking more towards certain visual qualities um, in the fiber and how it could be exploited, such as like overbeating abaca or linen and getting this incredible translucency. And so that, you know, really propelled a lot of activity at Dieu Donné as far as using and exploiting that artistically. So, uh, so for me, it's like, um, obviously, a paper that is overbeaten, the pulp that's overbeaten is, going to create problems about like how strong is this paper going to be at the end of um, you know longevity, and well, especially maybe with cotton. Um, even well, I guess with linen, like say if you folded it, it probably doesn't have the greatest fold endurance. So those kind of issues, like for me as an artist, like were in a way on the back burner. It wasn't like um something that prevented me from doing something. Like some artists would come in and say, "Can I put dirt in the pulp, or can I, do something that was like the antithesis of being archival?" And I would say, "Yes, of course." So that's sort of my attitude is that when an artist, is looking for something conceptually, that it overrides anything that, well, you can worry about, whatever longevity um, in the future or whatever. I mean, you can teach the artist, like what is the parameters of something that is long lasting or that has longevity. Um, and they can go from there and decide, oh, well, I want to do this anyway, or yeah, that's an issue, and perhaps, you know, I should consider, you know, how long is this piece of artwork going to last? So that's sort of my take on it.
Mm. Yeah, I think it's a really a good question. I would respond to it by backing up to the end paper project and the conservators' desire for something that was permanent and durable, but also embodied certain aesthetic characteristics that matched or was sympathetic to the historical papers. I got obsessed very early on with 15th century papers that have a certain kind of authenticity and character that I was mystified by. And, there are certain historical references to how papers were made, exactly how papers were made, but they're mainly 18th century French treatises. And the only thing left really to investigate, the only other path of investigation is the remaining historical specimens. And I got uh, very interested in using science to investigate these early sheets. And um, the Institute for Museum and Library Services funded a research grant where we used non-destructive testing to try to get at some of the essence of, what are the ingredients, what are the characteristics of these sheets, um, because I wanted to try to make paper like them. And what's interesting to me is after all this data was accumulated, and if you go ahead and you make paper using gelatin size and you hang it up and loft dry it and you burnish it, I found that you still didn't end up with paper that looked and felt like these early sheets. And for me, it was like, well, what the hell is going on? If it's not the ingredients, then what could it possibly be that gives these papers such a presence, such integrity? And I started to realize before I retired in 2020 that it probably has something to do with the fact that a team of three people could make 2,000 sheets of this stuff in a day. And during that process, there must be little things that happen to the sheet, little mistakes in the midst of well executed uniformity that help explain the spontaneity that you see in some of these early sheets. And so we did some testing. We discovered that we could make like 200 sheets in an hour. And so for me, I was satisfied that if you could do that in 10 hours, you could make 2,000 sheets. And not long after we did that, Mary Sullivan, one of my grad students at the time, came up to my desk out at the Oakdale Paper Facility, and she said, "Tim, let's try it." And I said, "Try what, Mary?" She said, "You know, 2,000 sheets in a day." And I said, "Oh, no, listen, that's going to be like 60 pounds of pulp and 800 feet of drying rope we'd have to set up in the ceiling, and I don't know. We did it in an hour, so we've shown that it can be done." She said, "Tim," and I could tell I had lost the argument. That was it. So anyway, long story short, we finally got around to trying this. First time we only made 1,350 sheets, but the second time we did it, but we only did it. It took 9.25 hours, and we had 13 people taking turns at the vat, and we were just exhausted at the end of the day. And the idea that people did this 6 days a week, their whole lives, was really impressive to us. So we learned a lot, and we also discovered that yes, there are little things that come out in the paper when you make paper that fast. So anyway, it's been really enjoyable for me talking about these two paths at Iowa and at Dieu Donné, and I'm sure that our colleagues in the hand paper making community would have similar stories to tell about their frustrations and rewards in being involved in this craft.
Mhm.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're just about out of time, but I just want to read two more comment questions and maybe we can just kind of answer them quickly. Um, Christine Manwiller writes, thank you so much for this talk. I really enjoyed thinking again about my short time at Iowa making paper with you, Tim. I'm curious about sourcing thicker Western papers that can be used to fill losses in prints and drawings that have primary support paper that's very weak. I've been experimenting with cast pulp papers in small formats I can make myself, but I'm curious if there are any sources within the papermaking community that I may be unaware of. I'm thinking of papers similar to Berlin insert paper from GMW. Thank you. So I don't know if you have any.
Um, well, I don't have any immediate sources. I will draw everyone's attention to Don Farnsworth's recent work. You can see what he's been up to if you just go to magnoliapaper.com. He's been doing some fascinating work with rediscovering the essence of felts used during the 15th century, fermentation, small, very, very small scale paper making for conservators. And therefore, he's been creating certain pulps that are appropriate to some of these paths forward. And he might be a big help. Christine, I think the best thing is if you email me and I'll put you in touch with him and say a little more about what he's been up to.
That's great. Yeah, that's terrific. And then lastly, we have a question and comment from Lee Running. Hello, Lee. Thank you so much for this conversation. I owe so much of my development as an artist to Paul and Tim. This conversation and images take me back, seeing the felts, equipment, drying system, and presses, so many memories. I taught courses with a chemist for years and used so many of the methods of record keeping I learned from Iowa and Dieu Donné to help my students track their creative and scientific research. Though many things can be recorded, the embodied knowledge from years of working closely with raw materials. Are any of you using this deep knowledge in your current work? So I don't know if Tim or Paul, you want to comment on any ways that you might be continuing to use some of these things. I know each of you are using the materials in different way. And Paul's shaking his head, but I know he's
Yeah,
just
I'm gonna,
being
I'm gonna,
shy.
I'm
I'm gonna
retired.
speak for Paul here partly and say that let me tell you that being retired is very, very cool. And you wake up every morning and you can
That's
do
true.
whatever you want. And you, so in my case, I've become completely obsessed with the restoration of Japanese lanterns, which requires the use
Okay.
of handmade paper, but it's really a side thing. And I have made no paper. I may make a little before I kick the bucket, but I haven't been doing that in any kind of routine way.
Yeah, and Paul is not commenting on this, but he's actually been coming in to Dieu Donné a lot lately to look at some of his artwork that we have in our archive now, and to talk about how those things were made, and quite a lot of it's going to a show that will be up next year at the Turchin Center, which is exciting. And, concentrating on, in a way, documenting and keeping this information, gathering some of the information
Hmm.
that all of you guys have in your heads, we all have in our heads, in our hands, in our bodies, um, is, I think, something that both of you have been doing really beautifully recently.
Oh, I have a little comment. I know Dieu Donné had recently worked with Hauser and Wirth's gallery to deal with um, preserving their documents and archive and so on and so forth. And I just have a comment that in a situation like that, someone needs to really work with somebody like that to be able to inform them as to how you would want that information to be cataloged and organized so that you can find something in storage that they have housed in boxes and so on and so forth, because their system to me is like trying to understand a different language. It doesn't make any sense. It's not chronologized by year or category or anything. So that those are my comments about
Yeah,
like keeping records and doing it the way you want them organized.
yeah, very good point. Well, thank you both for being with us all today.